sort of my worst fear is I'm flying off on a business trip and I'm meeting an important client for the first time. My wheelchair gets damaged on the way, so then I have to borrow one that isn't mine, that doesn't fit properly and whatever. And then I'm making a totally different impression on this, to me, important client than I would if I'm rolling into my own gear. It's like you showing up to that same meeting in somebody else's suit.
Hello and welcome to the Accessible Future podcast. I'm your host, Simon Jones, and I'm very excited to have you. I'm starting this show because we want to build an accessible future, and it really starts with education. So I'm stepping into this role as a student. I also invite you to learn along beside me. I'll be sitting down with experts from different fields to learn their perspective on how to remove barriers. So for our first episode, I got to sit down with a gentleman by the name of Peter Tonge, and his experience really highlights what this show is all about. He's the founder of Peter Tonge Consulting, who is an accessibility advisor and auditor. He's a retired criminal defense lawyer, a former manager at Statistics Canada, and a dedicated Rotary international volunteer. He's also a wheelchair fencer and a former murder ball player. Yes, I said murder ball. We'll get to that shortly. So he was born with cerebral palsy, and he's been in a wheelchair since he was age 4. His parents fought to put him in a quote-unquote regular school system. And you'll see that the belief that he belongs in the same space as everyone else runs through everything that he does. Before we get started, there are 3 things that I wanted to highlight that really stuck with me because I think they might stick with you. The first one was the gap versus barrier distinction. So a gap is really a space between where we are and where we need to be. And a barrier is really an obstacle already in place that keeps people out or keeps them away. Once you hear it from him, you'll really start seeing examples in the world around you. So the next up is the Airlines story. So his wheelchair got damaged in 1 of every 4 flights. And later on, he went to write an article around how airlines could transport racehorses better than they could transport his wheelchair. Really, this double standard is impossible to ignore. And so you'll hear more from him shortly. And the third piece is around culture versus compliance. And what Peter tells us is that meeting the bare minimum is far from being inclusive. So Peter's work is all about changing the attitude of people to be more inclusive. And there's so much more to learn about the great work that he has done, from the Canadian Human Rights Museum to wheelchair fencing, or to what an accessible future looks like to him. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Here's my conversation with him. Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast today. How's your day gone so far?
My day is great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you for being here. So I have to start with something fascinating that I recently learned about you. I understand that you're a data scientist, a criminal defense lawyer, an accessibility advocate, an accessibility auditor, and a podcaster. I look forward to discussing all of that with you. But first, is it true that you compete as a wheelchair fencer or sometimes play a sport called murder ball?
Okay, I'll talk about murder ball or wheelchair rugby. First, I did play a couple of seasons of that. It's a lot of fun. It's basically 4-on-4 on a court. Folks in heavy rugby chairs banging into each other, playing an adapted version rugby game. I played that for a couple of years. It was time for me to get some new, very expensive equipment. So I decided I wasn't going to do that to play recreationally. And it was about the same time that I was discovering wheelchair fencing, and that's really become my sport. I just love it. It's so much fun. It's competitive. You have these little sort of 15-minute bouts, and you think that's not going to be a big deal physically or athletically. I can tell you that it is, to be moving that quickly and that reacting. And it's just, I really poured myself into it. I think maybe if I have a regret about wheelchair fencing, it's the fact that I didn't start doing it 40 years ago. I was a latecomer to the sport, but it's become my favorite stress relief and my favorite thing to do.
As they say, it's better now than never, right?
Exactly.
So what is it like then? You bolted to the floor. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's exactly that. There are 2 competitors in wheelchairs bolted into a frame so you can't run away. And so it's really sort of close hand-to-hand combat. Some people have described it as a knife fight in a telephone booth. And in some ways it can be that. But it's interesting that you say about us being fixed, and that's different than stand-up fencers. The coaching team at Manitoba Fencers often gets their stand-up fencers to fence with this by sitting down, because it's also great training for them, because as young fencers, the first thing they're taught is to run away. Right? In this case, they don't get to do that. So they have to get used to being in close and reacting and doing those defensive things that aren't their first instinct. So good for the students and good for us as well.
Yeah. So when you're in a wheelchair, then it must be a lot of upper body physical activity then.
It is. There's a lot of sideways back and forth and moving out of the way. And so requiring a lot of core strength and balance, which is all stuff I need to work on besides the techniques of fencing.
So how long have you been doing fencing?
This is my third year.
Third year. So is it true then that you're a sailor, or you were a sailor?
It is. I again, this is a was, because unfortunately the organization that I sailed with no longer exists. But there used to be an organization in Britain called the Jubilee Sailing Trust. They had 2 adapted tall ships. And they had a program where they sailed all over the world with crews of half the people had disabilities and half the people didn't. And it's not a cruise, it's a working ship. So you're putting the sails up and down, you're cooking, you're cleaning, and you're doing all that stuff. Just a great skills building adventure. And what a great way to see the world. We got to dock in the main harbor in Monaco.
Wow.
Surrounded by multi-million dollar yachts. Right, and explore that whole area. It was really neat.
So how did you get around on the boat then?
It's interesting because what they have is they have sort of handholds all over the boat. So if the boat is rolling around, you can sort of find your way around and hold on as you go. And if it's really stormy or something, we can actually bolt the wheelchairs onto the floor or onto the deck so that we're not rolling around. Fortunately, I was never in a really big storm, but there have been some.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So we want to switch gears here a little bit. I read that you've been a wheelchair user since you were 4 years old, right?
I got my first chair when I was 4, yeah.
So how do you think growing up as a wheelchair user has impacted your perspective on accessibility?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, as a kid, I really didn't know what I didn't know. It was just what I had, and that was my life experience. As I grew up as an adult and an adult with an education, then I started to see the barriers for people with disabilities and whatever, and that's how I eventually ended up into this work of doing accessibility work and assessments. But as a kid, I was just one of the neighborhood kids. I didn't know it was a big deal that my parents were carrying me upstairs and doing all that stuff. I just thought that's what everybody did. But then you started to see it when I got older and I went to high school, for example. My neighborhood high school was completely inaccessible. So I ended up going to a high school literally at the other end of the city that was more accessible. And even that was, shaky, but it was better. So I started to understand that as a young adult as the kind of choices that had to be made and the kind of obstacles that were there.
Yeah. So back in those days, then how were you transported?
My parents did most of the transporting. They took a great deal of the load to make sure that I was getting where I needed to be. I think, to put it in a little bit of context, I'm the last of 5 children, and from my point of view, I think that was really important because they just decided that I was going to do everything that all of their other kids did, and it never occurred to them to do it in a different way. And I'm so fortunate for that.
That's amazing. So your parents really fought you to you stay in the regular school system then?
Oh, very much so. When I applied to go to quote unquote regular school, I mean, I was put through all kinds of testing and all kinds of whatever it was. They really had to make a case to have me there. To them, it was the completely natural thing to do because it's what all their other children had done.
Yeah.
But they had to work to get there.
That's excellent. So do you think then that your parents, you're fighting for you from such a young age, really pushed you to work hard to achieve so much in your life?
I don't know if I would really frame that way, other than the fact that I'm a person that's interested in many things, as you could tell. And when I get involved in things, I kind of get involved all in.
Yeah.
Right. I don't do things casually very well. So whatever I'm involved in, I tend to sort of be in the middle of it.
Yeah. Now I can see you're a very driven individual, and you're really fighting for really inclusion And
Absolutely.
speaking of more of your accomplishments, tell us a little bit or your role at Statistics Canada and as a criminal defense lawyer.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting transition. So for many years, more than 20 years, I worked at Statistics Canada. My background was in data analysis and computer science, a really good fit for an organization that runs on numbers. And I worked for most of my career in international trade, and we built all the computer systems that tracks all that stuff that goes back and forth across the borders, and talks about all the trade deficits and all the things we hear about so much now. Um, and then in about 2003, I was home. I tell the story. I was home one night for dinner with my wife, and I was talking about going about law school, which I'd done many times before. And she said to me, "Well, the whole time I've known you, you've talked about going to law school. Why aren't you going to law school?" And the way I describe it is I didn't have a good answer to why I wasn't going, so we made the decision to make it happen so that I could go. So it just turned out that at that time, my wife was finishing her PhD and looking for a teaching position. So we basically shopped our way across the country where she could find a teaching position and I could go to law school, and that was the University of Manitoba.
Incredible. So since then, you've been here in Manitoba since then?
Yes, that's right. We came to Manitoba in 2003.
So how does then that background that you learned from law school, how does that really you help when fighting for accessibility?
A couple of things. Law school does a really good job of teaching you how to deal with dense materials. So if governments are producing legislation around accessibility or policies or whatever, I have the ability to look at those and understand them and understand what the impacts of them are. You're also taught to be a polite and organized advocate, if I can say that, right? And what I mean by that is not necessarily jumping up and down with a placard, although sometimes that's appropriate for a situation, but it's putting together an organized argument on why what you're trying to do is what you should do to bring forward, right?
Yeah. So on this podcast, we want to talk about an accessible future, and we also want our guests to kind of give us some idea of what that would look like. So what does an accessible future look like to you, Peter?
An accessible future to me is one where companies and organizations, when they're putting together the work that they do or an event or designing a space, they automatically assume that people with various types of disabilities are going to be there. It's not an afterthought that someone with a disability might show up. Let's assume that we're going to have people that have difficulty hearing, difficulty moving, difficulty seeing, and so on, and build that into what we do. That, to me, is an accessible society.
So what barriers then do you think exist, and what do we have to overcome to achieve that accessible future?
Well, as I say, I still think in many circles there's still a perception that disability is an anomaly, and you might occasionally have somebody with a disability involved in what you do. It's simply not the case. So there's still that education and that understanding of people that planning ahead makes a huge difference. And I would say, from my experience in the work that I do, for most organizations, once it becomes part of what they do, it's not a huge impact on what they do. And the example that I can give is within your organization, every time you create a document, if you, as a matter of course, make that an accessible document, it doesn't add a lot to your document preparation day. It just becomes part of what you do.
Yeah. So that kind of brings to mind, you see a lot of information around airlines, for example. I was reading a little article you'd put together a few years ago on airlines can't seem to safely transport my wheelchair, but they found a way to move horses by air.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about what you went through on that.
Okay. One of my absolute pet peeves, but let me back up a little bit to give you some context. I travel a lot, both for business and pleasure. And when I travel, for those that don't know, they use a special narrow aisle wheelchair to transfer me from my wheelchair to the seat that I'm in the airplane, and that's where I stay basically for the duration of the flight. But the thing about that is, then my wheelchair is taken and put in cargo with all of the other cargo.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for many people, what ends up happening is your expensive wheelchair ends up getting damaged to some extent or the other. And everybody's different, but my experience is, I would say, about 25% of the time when I fly, my wheelchair gets damaged in some way.
Yeah.
And sometimes that really inconveniences the trip that I'm on or whatever. And sometimes it's relatively minor. But when you think about it, if somebody that doesn't use mobility equipment was injured 25% of the time that they flew by the airlines, they probably wouldn't want to fly with the airlines. And the story that you mentioned sort of really twigged this, because at that time, Air Canada proudly announced that they built a stable at Pearson Airport, and they had special caging and special feeding facility and special whatever so that they could move expensive racehorses. Well, if they can protect the expensive racehorse, they can put my chair in some sort of a container or an area where it doesn't need to be damaged, but I'm not paying a big fee to have my horse moved. So it just shows it can be done if you want to. They've chosen not to.
Yeah. So then, whenever you fly, say on vacation or you're going away on a business trip, out of all the times, is there sort of a percentage of the amount of times that your wheelchair would get damaged?
Oh, as I say, about 25% of the time there's some level of damage. I would say about a third of those times is damaged to the point where it needs to be repaired before I can use it.
And do you get any compensation from the airline? Like, what's their regulations for helping you out?
Typically, they're good about compensating and doing things like that, but that all takes time. There's the inconvenience of not being in your usual equipment. Like the example that I can give you that's sort of my worst fear is I'm flying off on a business trip and I'm meeting an important client for the first time. My wheelchair gets damaged on the way, so then I have to borrow one that isn't mine, that doesn't fit properly and whatever. And then I'm making a totally different impression on this, to me, important client than I would if I'm rolling in my own gear. It's like you showing up to that same meeting in somebody else's suit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's always a fear that you're going to be put in that position.
And do you find that it takes a while for your chair to get repaired?
Typically. So if it's really urgent, several days, but it's often weeks or months before the compensation and all that is sorted out.
Yeah. And so obviously being in a different wheelchair at an important client meeting must be, you got to figure out your environment again. It's a lot of learning curves, right?
Yes, exactly. As I say, it's like you, for example, arriving in someone else's suit and just not feeling comfortable and not yourself and not the impression they want to give in that situation, right?
I was recently reading an article on WestJet, actually,
right?
And one of their stipulations is that they can't transport a wheelchair over 300 pounds. But what's your take on that?
Frankly, I think that's ridiculous. They transport people all the time that are over 300 pounds. I mean, this is, and I don't want to read too much into it because, you can't read people's minds, but to me, it gives the impression that they just don't want to deal with some of that larger, more difficult equipment. And this is a nice way of saying we won't take your big stuff.
Yeah. So when you read these types of stories, does it feel like the industry has actually grown through this?
My impression of the airline industry is margins are so tight and costs are so closely controlled, they're not going to do anything that's going to cost them money, like giving up space for a larger washroom, unless they're regulated to do so, because one airline is not going to take that on and affect their cost and pricing structure if they can't be assured that all the airlines aren't.
Yeah, when you talk about confined spaces, it's kind of like it brings to mind a builder on a plot of land, right?
Yeah.
They put all these houses in, they cram them in as much as possible so they can get the best bang for the buck, right?
Yeah.
What do you think that airlines can do now to improve the accessibility for wheelchair users?
I think airlines, and this is airlines all around the world, I'm not going to pick on one or another. I think they have to stop making nice noises and really sit down with the community and say, okay, how can we really make it safer and more comfortable for you to fly? And then start negotiating with governments and other airlines and industry to have it done across so that everyone has the equal impact, right? That one airline isn't taking on the load. But to this point, they haven't been interested particularly in talking to the community. There's been a few sort of open forums and stuff, but I still get the feeling that it's much more performative than it is actually wanting to make change.
Yeah, no, they're not being as inclusive as they could be.
Right. And it's unfortunate because it's an industry that lots of folks with disabilities rely on because it's a quick way to get to one place to another for whatever reason, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So switching gears here, you're the founder of Peter Tonge Consulting, and you work as an accessibility auditor. So tell us a little bit more about what your consulting firm does.
Yeah, it's interesting because we use a model where when we're doing accessibility audits for a client, we bring together an accessibility assembly of community members of all various types of disabilities. So when we're doing an assessment, it's not just me and my life experience of using a wheelchair or, someone else's experience with being neurodivergent. We're also working with folks who are blind or low vision or deaf or other sort of cognitive processing things so that we get a broader picture of what's going on. Because when we started, clients would fairly ask me, what makes you the expert on disability? Well, I'm not. I have a certain set of knowledge and life experience, but we bring other people that sort of fill out that whole continuum.
Yeah. So if you were going into an organization and you're sitting down with them, what are some of the examples of what you talk about when it comes to accessibility?
Well, there's sort of a couple of levels. So there's the sort of physical accessibility into a building or into a structure. For example, can I get in the front door? Are there openers? Is there a safe place to wait? Can I use the washrooms? And all those sort of typical, or the first thing we think about, sort of ramps and toilets.
Yep.
But then there's also the other level of, is our website accessible? Can somebody with a screen reader read our website? Are the public documents that we're putting forward screen reader usable? In our hiring process, do we make an active offer to support people who are trying to apply and they need those supports? And then sort of the last piece, if you will, is how do we help organizations change the culture so doing this work just becomes a matter of course in what they do every day? And if we achieve that, then we've really done what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Touching on briefly, like the website you mentioned just now. So what are some of the things that you would suggest on a website?
Well, there is a particular standard that websites needs to meet to be accessible, and we won't go into that. That's why they put standards in books so we can look them up. But for example, you want your website set up in such a way that someone using a screen reader can navigate through it appropriately, so all the headings are properly set and the structures are properly set. For people that have low vision, you want high contrast and certain types of fonts. For every picture you have on your website, let's please have an alt tag so someone with the screen reader knows what that's about. And we had an interesting discussion yesterday about your alt tag reflecting what the purpose of that picture is. Not just describing the picture, but you put that picture there for a reason. Use the alt tag to explain that this picture is about a person with a disability considered bringing to an art class, for example. And also the same thing. If your website has videos on it, please let's have them captioned.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's doing those kinds of things. And I think one thing that organizations may not realize is for folks in the disability community, if they're going somewhere new or trying something new or going to a new place, the first thing they're going to do is go to the website and see what the place is about. So if the website isn't accessible or there's no accessibility information, I'm not feeling welcome and I may not
Yeah.
pursue it any further.
Yeah. No, it's good what you speak about, because that's usually the first place that people go to is a website to understand
Yes.
what the business or the organization actually does.
Yep.
So you've talked a little bit about the difference between a gap and a barrier.
Okay.
I've seen your descriptions on it. So can you tell the listeners today the difference between a gap and a barrier?
I can. So a gap is a situation where we are now and somewhere where we would like to get to. So there's work or programming or funding or something we need to do to fill that gap. And the one that immediately comes to mind is sort of the idea of employment for folks with disabilities, because employment rates are relatively low. There's a gap there. There's a lot more, many more people that could be working productively in the community, but it means the community needs to decide that that's a priority and work together to put the tools in place to fill that gap. A barrier is quite different because that, as barrier says, it's an obstacle, like not having a screen readable website. So it's then strategizing and planning and funding on how to remove the barrier. Now, the interesting part is they're both sort of calls to action to community, right? It's community to put things together to fill that gap that we talked about, or it's community working together to strategically remove a barrier, but it's always back to community.
Yeah. So then you've worked with organizations here locally like the U of M, University of Manitoba, Canadian Human Rights Museum. Is there any specific success stories from those accounts that you can tell us about?
I think there are many, but I think generally what I will say is all of our clients have been very open to making changes and becoming more accessible and whatever. There's always a fear when you're doing this kind of work, particularly when some industries are regulated and they have to produce an accessibility report, for example, that they're going to produce the report and put it up on the shelf. For our clients, people are really interested in making these changes and they want the information. Some people, because it really sort of, they want to be more accessible and it fits in our philosophy. And I think for others, it may just be that they can see that they're broadening their market, and I'm okay with that. It's okay to do that for that reason as well.
So I'm just thinking then, being in your shoes, having a client, their view shifts once you've sat down with them, you've had that session with them, and seeing how their view on accessibility has changed. It must be a joy to you.
Mm-hmm. That's the days that keep it going when it seems like a lot of work.
Yeah. I assume probably not every business has the budget to hire an external auditor all the time, but what are some of the things that should or shouldn't stop them from improving accessibility?
Well, I mean, there's lots of material out there on the internet and other places on how to make your organization more accessible, both physically and electronically and through communications. And for organizations that are interested in taking this on, grab a piece of it and start with one thing, and that success, I think, will spur you on to do more, because I think people are always surprised on what an impact it has when they start making those changes.
So it's just like little baby steps or little stepping stones in the right direction.
We always talk about, continuing to move forward. It's never, we may never get to perfection, but it's just taking on the attitude to move forward and trying to improve things.
Yeah. So a lot of businesses think that if they meet the building code, they're actually accessible. But in your consulting work, how do you explain the difference between legally compliant and culturally inclusive?
I say exactly that. The building code is very much the bare minimum and really talks about the physical. What we try to work with our organizations to do is to talk about the cultural. Again, expect that people with disabilities are going to show up. Think about how they can be included. Think of the advantages to doing that. Think about your program design or your product design. So it's really helping or trying to help people see it's not just a physical thing or a barrier. It's an attitude and it's community building.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of culturally inclusive you can share with us?
I do, and we did a lot of work with the Canadian Museum of Human Rights around some of their events and their ceremonies. And again, we put together an assembly of folks of various disabilities to go to some of their Indigenous ceremonies, for example, and we made suggestions on how to make them more accessible by improving the sound and creating some more space and things like that. And to the credit to the museum, they made those changes, and my group was able to go back to the next event and see the changes, and that was so critical because they felt that they were being listened to, and it was actually being done. It doesn't help the community if you take all the information in and then don't do anything with it. They're a good example of an organization who have used it, and the people that we work with have noticed. They've appreciated that, and they've told everybody that they know, and that's exactly what we want to do, right? That these folks are listening and they're doing what we ask.
Yeah. No, we did a day. I work on my day job at Move Mobility. We did a bit of a tour at the Human Rights Museum with a day program here in Winnipeg. Even they commented, okay, like this museum is really inclusive, and you could really see how they've taken what you sat down with them and told them. And you can see it.
And that's why I bring it up as the example, because that's really what we hope for, is that people take on new knowledge and new information and put it to good use. When we wrote the first accessibility report for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, or the first update, we called it a place of choice, because we want people within the community to know that it's a comfortable place and a place that they can go and safely do things and enjoy themselves.
So if I'm understanding correctly, then you're on you've been involved in the Rotary?
Yes, for a long time, over 20 years.
So for the listeners listening in, can you tell us what is the Rotary?
Okay, so Rotary International is a global service organization with about 1.4 million members, and we're divided. The Rotary world is divided up into districts, and the Rotary district in this area covers all of Manitoba, all of Saskatchewan, and part of northern Ontario. And then within a district, local towns and cities have Rotary clubs, and that's people that come together to do particular service projects. And service projects within Rotary can be anything from the environment to clean water to maternal health to literacy. And clubs are pretty autonomous on sort of the projects that they want to take on. My Rotary Club, for example, are the stewards of the Assiniboine Forest. And we have a big project going on to make the Assiniboine Forest more accessible, to upgrade the pathways, to put in accessible washrooms and stuff like that.
So then you must be able to connect with other groups overseas and see how they're doing things and implement them here?
Absolutely, and it's also supporting other groups overseas too. We've been working just over the last couple of weeks to support our Rotary friends in Minnesota, because of course they're going through all this, so we're working with them to support their food banks and things like that. And when all this was going on in Ukraine, my Rotary Club was very involved in supporting Ukrainian refugees that were coming to this area and providing furniture and those kinds of things. So it's neat because it really is a global impact.
That's amazing. So am I correct in saying that you hosted a podcast with the Rotary?
I do. I still host a podcast called Talking Rotary, and we talk about Rotary projects all over the world. Sometimes we talk about philosophy, but it's usually projects.
So where can people find out more information about the podcast you did?
You can look up Talking Rotary on anywhere you get your podcasts. It's on all of the major platforms. So
Excellent.
I recommend a listen. I enjoy it. I enjoy doing it.
Excellent. So that's all the time we do have today. I do really appreciate you joining us here on this podcast. But before we go, if someone is listening in today and they want to learn more about your consulting firm or even some of the sports you've got involved in, how do they find out about you?
Please go to petertongeconsulting.com and all the links are from there. Find out about the company, and I'm pretty sure there's links to the other things that I do as well. So, and anyone can reach out to me at any time. I'm always happy to answer an email or a text.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Peter. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. And what a great conversation to start this podcast off with. So one thing that Peter talked about that I keep coming back to is his topic around building codes. If we're just meeting the bare minimum with our buildings or with our new facilities that we're investing in, we're not really being inclusive. It means that you're doing the least amount that you're legally required to. But in a truly accessible future, we need to be doing more. It's about how you build your space, your hiring process, even your website, or everything else that you do. And the idea of moving from compliance to culture is something we're going to be talking a lot about on this show. And speaking of inclusion, our next episode, we actually have the L'Arche Group, and we're really excited to bring that to you. If you haven't heard of L'Arche, they provide care for people living with disabilities, but they have a really unique setup where the people providing the care actually live in the same home as the individual. It's a really beautiful story, and I cannot wait to share it with you. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed today's show, make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening from. It makes a huge difference in helping people find the show. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. I'll put the links to those in the show notes below, and along with the information for Peter Tonge if you want to get in touch with him. Thank you so much for spending the time with us on The Accessible Future. We'll see you on the next show.